Hi, I'm Mark Neiman Ross, and welcome to this week's edition of Raspberry Pi Weekly. Every week, we explore the Raspberry Pi and share useful tips. To use Node-RED with our three Raspberry Pis, the publisher, broker, and client, you need to start Node-RED on each Raspberry Pi, note the IP address, and then edit the Node-RED code on each platform. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm looking at the publisher, and I go to the Raspberry Pi menu, I go to Programming, and I go up here to Node-RED, and you can see that I've started Node-RED. Take note of the HTTP address that is shown at the line that says, once Node-RED is started, point to browser at. In this case, it's 10.16.18.61:1880. That's an important number. You can go ahead and leave Node-RED running. Now let's go take a look at the MQTT broker. Just like we did with the MQTT publisher, on the broker, I'll go to the Raspberry Pi menu, Programming, Node-RED, and I'll start Node-RED on the broker. And again, Node-RED provides me with an IP address, in this case 10.16.18.195:1880, and I'll write that down. You can go ahead and leave Node-RED running, and then let's go look at the client. Now I'm looking at the Raspberry Pi that's performing as an MQTT client. Once again, go to the Raspberry Pi menu, Programming, and start Node-RED. When Node-RED is started, it provides you with an IP address, in this case 10.16.18.30:1880. I've written down those IP addresses for the publisher, for the broker, and the client, and now I'm ready to edit Node-RED on each one of those machines. So let's go ahead and open up editors. We're now looking at a web browser with three Node-RED IDEs, one for each one of the Raspberry Pis. This happens to be talking to the MQTT publisher, and you can tell that because the Node-RED IP address is 10.16.18.61. Likewise, here's the MQTT broker and the MQTT client. Let's start setting up the MQTT publisher. Now I've included Node-RED code for publisher, client, and broker, and if you want to, you can just bring it in. If you just want to import the Node-RED code, go to the hamburger in the right-hand side, go to Import, Clipboard, then select the file to import, go to the exercise files, and in this case, you'd import the publisher flow. This is what it looks like, and it's fairly easy to understand. The first node is the pin on the GPIO. I've selected pin 7. I've told it to be a pull-up resistor and to read the initial state of the pin on deploy restart. Pin 7 will send a message out, and I need to transform that message into either MQTT publisher is on or MQTT publisher is off. Node-RED relies on JavaScript for its logic, and if you examine this code, you'll see how JavaScript is simply looking for a less than or greater than 1 symbol and then changing message.payload to equal whether the MQTT publisher is on or off. Finally, the publisher takes that message and sends it out to my RPI broker. Now, in this case, let's take a look at what the my RPI broker actually is. Here you can see 10.16.18.195, which is a familiar number since that's the IP address of the Raspberry Pi that's performing as a broker, at least on my system. In your case, you're going to want to change this number to reflect your broker's IP address. Leave the port as 1883. When you've made all the changes that are necessary, hit deploy, and that updates the code on the publisher Raspberry Pi. Next, let's take a look at the client. Again, you can see the IP address, 10.16.18.30, and that's the number that I wrote down for the Raspberry Pi client. In this case, it's looking for a topic called LinkedIn Learning/Raspberry Pi. It's talking to my RPI broker, which you'll recall we've set up to talk to the IP address for the broker on my system. This number will change for you. You'll need to know what your broker number is. Don't forget to set the topic as LinkedIn Learning/RPI Weekly. That needs to be consistent in order for the publisher, broker, and client to all communicate together. Now, because this message is coming from the broker, I need to convert it to digital so that I can actuate one of the GPIO pins where I have an LED attached to it. So I'm using Convert Message to Digital. This comes from the nodes on the left-hand side. And in this case, what I've said is I want to change the payload of the message. I want to search for, with a regular expression, for anything that ends in off, and I want to replace it with 0. Likewise, I want to look for the message payload for anything that says on and change it to a 1. I've put in a debug node so I can watch what's coming out, and then I've said, send that digital 1 or 0 to GPIO 26, which is actually board pin 37. The type is digital output, and an input must be 0 or 1. Once you've made the changes necessary, don't forget to hit Deploy to make the change. This will update the client Raspberry Pi. Finally, let's set up the broker. I'm using a Mosca MQTT broker, which is probably not installed on your system. Let me show you how to install a node in your copy of Node-RED. Go up to the hamburger on the right-hand side, and then select Manage Palette. Click on Install, and search for MQTT, and you're looking for Node-RED Contributed MQTT Broker, the first one that shows up on my system here. Normally I would hit Install. I've already installed it. But your button will look like this. It'll have the install on it. Install that. When it gets done, you can close this window. And then you can search for it by going up to the left-hand palette and look for MOSCA. You'll see the node. You can drag it in, just like I've done here, and it'll be titled Mosca MQTT Broker. Let's take a quick look at what that looks like. Inside, you'll see MQTT port 1883, which is consistent across the publisher, broker, and client, and all of the other fields you can leave blank. The Mosca MQTT broker is already configured to work the way it should. I've attached a message payload so I can watch what's coming out of the broker. Don't forget to hit Deploy. That updates the broker Raspberry Pi. Once you've installed Node-RED on publisher, client, and broker, the system should be working. Now we can observe the behavior of our MQTT system running on Node-RED by pushing the button on the publisher, and you'll notice that the red light goes on the client. There are other things you'll notice as well. For example, we can watch the publisher. On the right-hand side, you'll see a message appear. At a certain time, the MQTT publisher is on. And then when I release the button, the MQTT publisher goes off. Likewise, the broker displays a message. When I push the button, you can see that 2 packets are sent out, one for button down and one for button up. Now, I'm not interpreting what those packages are, but I do know they're going to a client. And let's take a look at that. Here's the Node-RED code for the MQTT client. When I push the button, you can see that I get a 1 followed by a 0. The 1 indicates the button is down. The 0 indicates the button is up. So that's a whirlwind tour of how to set up Node-RED to run MQTT with your Raspberry Pi system. Thanks for joining me for this episode of Raspberry Pi Weekly. Be sure to join the LinkedIn group and check out previous episodes on LinkedIn Learning. I'll see you next week with more Raspberry Pi adventures.